At the company couple's party, I was still holding a half-empty glass when I saw the man approach her. He didn't look like a coworker, nor did I look like someone we knew. He was a stranger with a cynical, self-assured smile, the kind that walks into a room as if he already knows exactly what he's going to get out of it. And what he wanted, was my wife. He arrived with rehearsed charm, a simple, direct, invitation, and to my astonishment, she agreed to dance. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me. She just went. And I froze. I felt like the whole world had slowed down, but inside, my heart screamed as if someone were squeezing it with both hands. I couldn't think straight. Why had she done this? Why so easily, so quickly? I stood up, crossed the room with hard, silent steps, and stopped in front of them. The music seemed to mock my pain. I stared at her. "What is this?" I asked in a low, firm voice. She said nothing. And he just smiled at the corner of his mouth, with a look of someone who knew something I didn't. An intimate look. A look she knew. And she remained silent. That silence was the answer. There was nothing more she could say. It was as if, there, in front of me, she had revealed, without needing words, that she no longer chose me. Not at that moment. And probably, she hadn't chosen me for a long time. I left the party without saying goodbye to anyone. I crossed the city with heavy eyes and my mind drowning in a grief no one saw. The pain of losing someone alive is infinitely more cruel than that of losing someone to death. When you die, love remains. When you're betrayed, love rots. I moved to another city a few days later. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to hear explanations. I didn't ask her to stay, I didn't beg, I didn't yell. I just left. Because I knew that if I stayed, I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand something she had already decided, and that not even she herself could explain properly. I left everything behind, our apartment, our photos, our plans, and even our smiles. The ones I thought would last forever. I settled somewhere else, started a new life, and, little by little, I relearned how to breathe without her weight on my lungs. I didn't hate her. But I also couldn't love her with the same purity I used to. Betrayal does this, it burns what was clean, it empties what was full, it distorts what was beautiful. Meanwhile, she believed everything was fine. That the new man beside her was the right choice, that he would be the future I wasn't. But her love was too new to be solid. It was a flash in the pan that burned quickly but didn't last long. She believed she was being chosen intensely, but she didn't realize she was being used momentarily. Because the difference between passion and love is that passion makes promises in the first week and fades in the third. Love endures when no one else can. And she realized this too late. The man, who seemed perfect at first, soon grew tired of her. He left. As easily as he arrived. There was no drama, no fighting. Just emptiness. A silence unlike the one she had with me, that was the silence of an end. And that's when something shifted inside her. For the first time, she felt the pain of being left without warning. Of watching plans fall apart halfway through. Of looking to the side of the bed and seeing only her own reflection in the dark. Of going through old photos and discovering that the best memories were with me, not him. Of remembering the way I hugged her when she woke up startled in the middle of the night. Of remembering the way I said, "Stay," even when she was already packed to leave herself. She began to see that what I felt was true love. Love without show, without shouting, without demands. It was a love that cared in silence, that listened attentively, that forgave even the harsh words of a bad day. A love she would never find again. And then, remorseful, she made a decision, she would come to me. She would knock on the door of the house where I was trying to rebuild myself. She would face me head on. She would ask for forgiveness. Tell me she was wrong. That she had lost herself in me. And that I wanted to go back. She hadn't expected to find me like this. I was no longer the devastated man from the party. I had changed. Time had made me understand that true love is a two-way street, and that if someone crosses the street without looking back, it's not worth chasing. She arrived with teary eyes, her shoulders slumped, her soul broken. But she found a different look in me. A calm look. A firm look. A look that said, I forgive you, but I don't want you anymore. And that was the final blow. Because sometimes, the true punishment isn't abandonment, it's forgiveness. Because forgiveness ends the cycle, but closes the door forever. She saw me beside another woman. A simple woman with eyes that knew the value of loyalty. And for the first time, she understood she'd lost. Not a man. She'd lost love. The true one. The only one. And that there was nothing she could do to turn back the clock. Are you with someone else? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes. And I love her, I said. She stood still, as if her entire world had collapsed inside her. Do you forgive me? She whispered. I smiled ruefully. Of course I do. But we don't go back. Not to how it was, not to what it was. She looked at the floor, then back at me. There were tears in her eyes, but there was no drama. It was just pure pain. Real pain. That silent pain of someone who understands that the price of a wrong choice is living with regret. And then, without another word, she left. Heart in her hand. And I stayed. No longer out of pride, but because I finally understood that I deserved something different. I deserve a complete love. One that doesn't need to dance with someone else to know that I am the man of her life. She had me. She had me completely. And she chose emptiness. Now I'm the one who chooses not to go back. But what she did after all this, no one expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal never will be romanticized. All the stories you will hear are fiction, but they carry profound truths, showing that betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also yourself. Every choice has a price, and in this story, you'll feel the weight of every consequence. Get ready. Because what's coming next is shocking. Good story. They met on a random afternoon, the kind that doesn't portend destiny, but carries within its serendipity a milestone that only time can reveal. Liam was a focused, discreet man, possessing an observant gaze that always seemed 2 steps ahead of events, yet at the same time easily lost when she smiled. Emma, on the other hand, carried a light yet intense energy. She had the sweetness of someone who listened with her eyes, and the restlessness of someone who longed to live every possible version of their own life. Together, they were improbable and yet perfect, like 2 halves shaped by opposite trajectories who, by a whim of life, decided to walk in the same direction. They began their relationship with the intensity of those who find refuge in each other, but also with the caution of those who had suffered before. They weren't teenagers discovering love, they were adults trying to preserve it. Their story wasn't made of fiery promises, but of simple gestures. Liam, with his methodical way, liked to make breakfast even on busy days. Emma, for her part, had a habit of leaving notes around the house, with short but affectionate phrases. They knew each other in detail, the way she wrinkled her nose when she read something that didn't make sense, his silence when something bothered him but he preferred to keep it to himself. She helped him relax, to smile more lightly. He made her feel safe, as if she were home even when they were apart. To outsiders, they were the picture of a stable couple. There was no excess, no shouting, no suffocating demands. There was complicity, or at least, that's what Liam believed with all his might. They shared a simple but vibrant apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but everything was carefully chosen. The wine-stained sofa from their first New Year's Eve together, the crooked painting on the living room wall that Emma never let Liam straighten because, according to her, it gave it character, and even the neglected plants that endured more out of her stubbornness than their own care. It was a home. It was a reflection of a shared life, with all the little rituals that only make sense to those who experience them. They had photos scattered about, fridge magnets of places they'd visited, a bulletin board full of lists and reminders. And, above all, they had plans. So many plans. To get married, to travel more, maybe to think about having children, but only after a certain stability. Emma wanted to pursue graduate studies abroad. Liam said he would wait for her, even if it meant agonizingly missing her. They talked about the future with a calmness that only true love can sustain. Liam worked at a tech company, in a stable position that required dedication but also gave him a certain pride. He was committed, reliable, and always willing to go above and beyond what was expected. Emma worked in marketing for a multinational company and had recently been promoted, which brought even more enthusiasm to her routine. I enjoyed the vibrant environment, the challenges, and the connections the job offered. She felt valued, recognized, and seen. Liam admired this part of her. He admired her eagerness to grow, her independence, the sparkle in her eyes when she shared the ideas she presented at the last meeting. He never felt overshadowed, on the contrary, he was proud to see her expand. Friday nights were sacred. They had an informal agreement to dine out or at home at least once a week, but always together. Sometimes they ordered in and watched reruns. Other times they cooked together, stumbling and laughing. It wasn't a perfect routine, but it was theirs. And it was real. On weekends, they liked to explore new places, parks, hidden cafes, cultural fairs. Liam was more reserved, Emma more outgoing. He observed the world calmly, she traversed it as if trying to absorb everything at once. The difference between them was what united them. She pushed him out of his comfort zone, he made her breathe deeply. There was a silent trust between them that seemed unshakable, or at least Liam felt it deeply. He never worried about proof of love, because her love was visible in her everyday gestures, in the hands that sought him out at night, in the voice that called him "my harbor" in difficult times. The couple's friends always commented on how well matched they were, how they seemed to be made for each other. They attended dinners, events, and company get-togethers. Liam, more discreet, avoided overexposing himself, but made a point of being present, supporting Emma in everything. He attended social events even though he didn't particularly enjoy them, because he knew how important they were to her. And, despite the weariness of the routine, he never failed to reinforce, with his actions, that his love for her was genuine. Liam wasn't the type to make grand declarations, but he demonstrated it silently, in everyday life. In the car, when she fell asleep leaning against his shoulder. At the grocery store, when he remembered to buy her favorite chocolate. In his care to ensure everything was provided. And Emma sensed this, even though, over time, the world around her began to present her with other possibilities. At the company, Emma began to interact with different people, full of new stories, intriguing lifestyles, and looks that awakened forgotten feelings. None of this was part of a plan. Things simply began to change as the months passed. The environment made her feel more alive, more desired, more free. And although everything at home seemed stable, something inside her began to question whether that stability was still enough. It wasn't a lack of love, but perhaps an excess of doubts. Emma began to live in two rhythms, that of her life with Liam, calm, secure, predictable, and that of her professional life, hectic, engaging, and full of stimulation. This left her divided, but she still tried to maintain balance. She woke up every day with a full head, but her heart still found a certain rest with him. Liam didn't notice any drastic changes, but he was sensitive enough to notice that she was different. More distracted, more absent, less enthusiastic in the conversations that once seemed endless. He didn't demand anything. He tried to adapt. He thought it was just a phase, that her work was demanding more, that it was a natural part of adulthood. After all, he too had his pressures, his demands. And love, he believed, knew how to weather these periods. He continued to support, encourage, trying to keep alive what they had built together. He didn't suspect anything. He believed in her with a silent faith. He was the kind of man who trusted because he loved, and not the other way around. It was this kind of surrender that made him a rare partner. And, therefore, also a vulnerable man. Emma, for her part, wavered between gratitude for the man by her side and a growing restlessness within her. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was her age, the pressure of living a single story, the curiosity about what else was out there. But she didn't talk about it. She kept it to herself. She said she was tired, said she needed time alone to think, but she was still present. There was still tenderness in her touches, there were still smiles on good days. But there was also silence. A silence that didn't scream, but whispered an unease that, in time, would begin to make room for other desires. She didn't want to hurt Liam. But she also didn't want to feel trapped in a life that, however solid, was beginning to feel narrow. And so the days went by. A couple who, in the eyes of the world, were an example of partnership, but who, deep down, were beginning to be inhabited by questions not always voiced out loud. Liam still believed. Emma still hesitated. And, in that universe where they walked side by side, an invisible thread began to stretch, silently, dangerously. There was no rupture yet. There was no secret yet. There was no betrayal yet. But there was distance. A distance measured not in meters, but in silences. And it was within these silences that fate prepared what would come next. Because sometimes, what destroys a story isn't what happens suddenly, but what slowly unravels, while no one notices. And at that moment, neither of them knew what was about to be put to the test. Time passed with the same subtlety as cracks appear in a wall, slowly, imperceptibly at first, until they became impossible to ignore. Liam and Emma's routine continued, but something inside her began to slip through her fingers, like fine sand through her fingers. He remained the same dedicated man he always was, the one who came home tired from work but still insisted on making dinner, who remembered the small details of her day even when she seemed to no longer pay attention to his. He still kissed her forehead before bed, even when the kiss wasn't returned with the same tenderness. He still listened attentively, even when her words were laced with impatience. And even faced with the gradual coldness that took shape in her gestures, Liam didn't question it. He attributed it all to stress, overwork, the pressures that adult life inevitably brings. He was patient, understanding, and believed that love, when real, was capable of weathering the silent storms. Emma, however, no longer saw his calm as comfort. She began to see it as monotony. In the office corridors, between meetings and corporate events, she began to be enchanted by the constant presence of a new colleague, someone who had recently joined the creative team. He was charismatic, self-assured, and seemed to move with the lightness of someone carrying little weight. Unlike Liam, whose gaze bore the depth of someone who has known pain and endured. This new man, soft-spoken and with a confident smile, complimented Emma with a frequency Liam no longer used, not out of disinterest, but because he believed she knew she was admired. He commented on her intelligence, her creative ideas, her good aesthetic taste. He did so with an unpretentious but carefully calculated tone. Emma, at first, kept her distance, as if recognizing her limits. But little by little, she began to allow herself to cross them. First with smiles, then with longer conversations, then with glances that lasted too long. She hadn't planned to get involved. It wasn't something planned. It happened as it does with anything that's indulged too much, slowly, to the point where it was no longer possible to distinguish between innocent attention and hidden desire. Work dates became moments she eagerly anticipated. Texting, previously only about agendas and deadlines, now included stray sentences mid-work that made her smile. Emma began hiding her phone when she was with Liam, avoiding talking about her co-workers, especially that man. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to tell. Liam, for his part, remained aloof. He still believed love was enough, still prepared Friday dinners, still made plans for them. And his purity made Emma feel, increasingly, like someone who didn't deserve that love. The peak of their emotional disconnection occurred on an ordinary evening, when Liam suggested a trip for them both. He wanted to escape the routine, reconnect, relive the beginning. He spoke enthusiastically, with a sparkle in his eyes. Emma simply nodded with a hollow smile, looking away. That proposal, which years before would have thrilled her, now felt like an invitation to a reality she was no longer sure she belonged in. The following week, she started coming home late. She said work was demanding. She said she needed to focus on a new project. Liam, as always, believed her. He always trusted her like someone who trusts their own instincts, and that was his greatest blind spot. Sometimes, love teaches us to see with our eyes closed, and this surrender, so beautiful, can also be the door through which pain enters. Weekends lost their essence. Conversations were brief, touches more scarce, laughter more distant. Liam, silently, began to wonder if something had changed. But when he asked her if everything was okay, Emma smiled, saying yes, that it was just fatigue. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe. Because to distrust would be to give voice to a fear he didn't know if he had the strength to face. His loyalty wasn't just to Emma, it was to his idea of love. And so he persisted. He believed that time would make things right. That she would return to being the woman who, every night before bed, told him he was the best home she'd ever known. As the weeks passed, Emma's relationship with the other man grew more than just emotional. It began with a subtle touch, a more intimate compliment, an invitation for a drink after work. She hesitated. But she went. And before she knew it, she was already on the other side of a line she should never have crossed. Their first kiss happened in a dark parking lot, inside his car. It was quick, confusing, filled with guilt and desire at the same time. Afterward, she cried. She cried when she got home and saw Liam sleeping on the couch, a book open on his lap, waiting for her. She cried because she knew she had broken something inside her. But she didn't stop. The relationship continued. In secret. At off-peak times. On dates disguised as work commitments. And the guilt that had once consumed her was drowned out by adrenaline, by the sense of freedom, by the mistaken idea that there was still time to discover other sides of herself. Emma began treating Liam more gently, as if kindness could make up for mistakes. As if caring for him were a way of asking for forgiveness without having to confess. But the emotional distance between them was increasingly evident. Liam sensed it, but he kept quiet. He didn't want to force it. He didn't want to suffocate. He just waited. And this wait was a silent punishment. The invitation to the company's couples party arrived by email. It was a traditional event, something they attended together every year. Emma didn't seem excited, but she accepted. She said it would be good for both of them, that they needed to get away for a while. Liam believed it could be a moment of reconnection. He bought a new tie, her favorite. He booked a car, dressed up meticulously, and prepared a shy compliment he intended to deliver when he saw her ready. Emma emerged from the room in an elegant dress, her hair down, and subtle makeup. She looked beautiful. And he complimented her sincerely. She smiled, but with her eyes downcast. They left the house together, but that day, they weren't in the same place. The party was bustling. Soft lights, ambient music, couples everywhere. Liam tried to stay close, commenting on the guests, trying to lead her into light conversation. Emma, on the other hand, was restless. She glanced around frequently, as if searching for something, or someone. Until he appeared. The man from work. The same man who had been occupying spaces within her that had previously belonged to Liam. He approached, greeted them both naturally, but there was something in his gaze, something that escaped words. Liam, polite as always, greeted her back. And then, without ceremony, he extended his hand to Emma and asked her to dance. Time seemed suspended for a few seconds. And she accepted. Liam didn't understand right away. He stood there, watching them walk away onto the dance floor. He thought it was strange. Inappropriate. But he didn't suspect anything, not yet. Until, mid-dance, he noticed something. The look. That damned look between them. A look not shared between acquaintances. A look he knew, because it had once been his. And it was in that moment that everything fell apart. He stood up, crossed the room, stopped in front of them, and asked in a nearly muffled voice, "What is this?" Emma remained silent. The man just smiled, with the corner of his mouth, with the mischief of someone who knows exactly where he stands. And there, in that heavy silence, Liam understood. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need a scene. He just needed to get out of there. And that's what he did. He turned his back. He left without saying goodbye. And with each step away, he left behind not only the woman he loved, but also the part of him that still believed love was enough to keep someone close. And even without knowing it, he was about to discover something even more devastating than betrayal. Something that would change the way I viewed everything they'd experienced. Because, in that story, the worst was yet to come. Liam's silence after the party was more devastating than any scream, any explosive reaction, any confrontation. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't come home. He disappeared from their routine without leaving an emotional trace behind. He simply left. Emma spent the first few hours trying to believe he would return, that it had been an impulse of anger, an instinctive reaction. But when dawn came and his side of the bed remained untouched, and his scent seemed to fade with the passing hours, she began to understand that she would lose something she hadn't even known how much she still needed. Days passed without news. She tried calling, texting, emailing. All were ignored. She went to his work, he had quit. She reached out to mutual friends, none of them knew where he had gone. It was as if he had vanished from the map, carrying on his back the wounded love and a dignity she only now realized she had completely neglected. The man Emma had been involved with, the one who seemed the opposite of everything Liam represented, also began to change. Over time, their encounters lost their intensity, the conversations became lukewarm, the compliments became rare. What once seemed intriguing was now just another empty repetition of interest. He never said outright that it had been fleeting, but his absence and disinterest spoke volumes. Emma tried to maintain some connection, but realized that this man wouldn't fight for her the way Liam did. That he didn't care about her crises, that he wouldn't mind seeing her leave if she chose another path. It was at that point that she felt the ground slipping away. Not just for having lost Liam, but for having lost herself, for having destroyed something solid for a momentary impulse, for having confused desire with freedom, for having exchanged a deep-rooted love for a superficial whim. Months later, already torn apart inside, she finally discovered where Liam was. He had moved to a smaller, calmer city, far from the chaos and her memories. He had found a new job, a new routine, and, to the surprise that was yet to come, a new wife. Emma learned this by chance, seeing a photo on social media of an old acquaintance. He was different. Not sad, not bitter, he was at peace. Smiling with a subtle sparkle in his eyes, the kind that comes when the soul finds peace after a long time at war. Emma decided she needed to see him. Not to win him back, at least that's what she told herself. She needed to ask for forgiveness by looking him in the eye, needed to return something she had unwittingly taken, the truth. She wanted to face the consequences. And, who knows, hear that, despite everything, it was still possible to rebuild something. Even if it was just respect. She left without warning. She went to the address she'd managed to find with difficulty. She walked to the small house with a well-kept garden, where she saw flowers that clearly weren't there by chance. Flowers with meaning. She approached with a racing heart, a lump in her throat, and knocked on the door. Liam answered with a serenity that immediately disarmed her. There was a visible time between them, as if years had passed since they'd last seen each other. She hesitated. She wanted to cry. He simply said, "Come in if you want to talk." They sat in the living room. Emma took a while to speak. She said she wasn't there to justify anything, because she knew what she'd done was unforgivable. She said she'd lost everything, that she'd made a mistake, that she'd hurt the only man who truly loved her. Liam remained silent, listening with a respect that hurt more than any insult. When she finished, he sighed, looked at her with a calmness that seemed impossible, and said, "I forgive you." Emma couldn't hold back her tears. He had been great even in pain. She asked him if there was still love. And he replied, "There was, for a long time. But not today. Today, I love someone who loves me back." And that sentence was the final point she never wanted to read. Emma thanked him, stood, and said that, even without reconciliation, that forgiveness was all she needed to try to move on. He walked her to the door. She took the first steps outside, but something made her turn back. There was something in the garden. Something that instinctively caught her attention. A photograph, in a simple frame, on a wooden bench. It was a picture of her and Liam, from when they were together. But that wasn't what unsettled her. Beside the photo was a letter, carefully folded, in her handwriting. A letter she had never written. Curious, but still not understanding, she turned to him and asked, "Why was that letter there?" Liam took a few seconds to answer. Then he said, "This is the part you never knew. The secret I've kept to this day." Emma stood still, her heart pounding. Liam took a deep breath. He said that weeks before the party, he'd known something was off. He'd reluctantly hired a close friend who worked in cybersecurity, who alerted him to possible messages between her and his coworker. He didn't want to confront her. He wanted to wait. See how far it would go. Then, upon discovering the time and place of their meeting, he decided to go. And he saw it. He saw it with his own eyes. Emma, in the other man's car, the two of them too close to deny the obvious. She didn't notice, but he was there. He didn't make a fuss, didn't take pictures, didn't scream. He simply went home and began planning his exit. The letter was a farewell. It was his last attempt to explain himself before he left. But he never had the courage to deliver it. He thought, deep down, she didn't deserve to know. But now, he thought she needed to. Emma took the letter with trembling hands and began to read. With each line, his face changed. His words were sweet, sad, profound. He spoke of how hard he tried, how much he loved her, how disappointed he was, not by the betrayal itself, but by the cowardice of never having spoken. He spoke of his fear of confronting her, of losing his dignity, of the pain of feeling invisible. He spoke of the love he felt for her, of the dream he had of children, of growing old with her. And at the end of the letter, a sentence cut like a knife: "You didn't lose me when you betrayed me. You lost me when you thought I would never notice." Emma couldn't hold the paper. She wept silently, feeling the weight of all the decisions she'd made without considering. Liam remained standing there, serene. She tried to justify herself, mumbling something about feeling confused, but he simply raised his hand and said, "It doesn't matter anymore. I've accepted it. You did what you thought was right at the time. But now it's too late." She then asked, her voice almost muffled, "Do you still see me as the woman of your life?" And he replied with the coldness of someone who had to learn to protect themselves, "You were. But today, you're no longer." And in that moment, she understood what she'd never wanted to accept, that forgiveness doesn't erase choices, and that there are wounds that time doesn't heal, only teaches us to live with them. When she left the house, she took with her the letter, the pain, and the certainty that she would never find a man who loved her like that again. Because loves like that are never repeated. They are wasted. And then, they are lost forever. Emma left the house aimlessly, clutching the folded letter to her chest as if it were the last tangible memory of a story that, once upon a time, she believed would never end. The sky was overcast, the wind biting her skin, and inside, the cold was even more cruel. She had walked 2 blocks when her legs gave out, forcing her to sit on a park bench. The dry leaves danced around her, as if mocking her solitude. She opened the letter again, rereading the last lines with misty eyes. Each word carried the weight of concrete. It was as if Liam had left part of his soul on that paper, and now, even from a distance, he still stared at her through the confessions not spoken aloud. She felt nauseous, not from anger, nor from wounded pride, but from the bitter realization that all that silence of his was actually a scream. And she never listened. Never wanted to listen. Because, perhaps, she never believed she could lose him. The next day, Emma returned to his house. This time, it wasn't on impulse, it was out of necessity. She needed to say more. She couldn't accept that everything would end with that dry goodbye. She wanted to ask about the new woman, wanted to understand what was between them. Not out of jealousy, but because she needed to know who had occupied the space that, for so long, had been hers alone. She knocked hesitantly. Liam answered, his expression no longer surprised. He simply said, "It's too early for questions." But she insisted. She asked only for coffee, for 10 minutes, anything. He took a deep breath, gave her space, and let her in. This time, the room seemed even stranger. There were new paintings, different books, scents she didn't recognize. And on the sofa, a carefully folded feminine blanket. Every detail was a reminder that she was no longer part of this scene. They sat in silence. He brought the coffee, she held the cup without drinking. The tension was thick, almost palpable. Then Emma looked him in the eye and asked what he felt when he looked at her now. Liam took his time, thought, as he always did before saying something he knew would make a lasting impression. "I feel respect. But no longer love. And that's hard to say, because I once loved you so much I swore I couldn't live without you." Emma lowered her gaze. The pain wasn't just in the words, but in the serenity with which they were spoken. He was over it. She wasn't. She still carried the baggage of regret. So she tried one last trick. She said she wasn't there to win anything back, but that she wanted to be honest, at least once. She confessed that, after the breakup, she tried to move on, but couldn't. That the man she traded Liam for was empty, superficial, and never offered shelter, only distraction. She confessed that she regretted it immediately after their first kiss, but didn't have the courage to go back. That pride and confusion took over, and she let herself get carried away, even knowing there was someone at home who loved her deeply. Liam listened calmly, but his gaze was no longer responsive. There was a peace in his face born of the absence of expectation. He expected nothing more from her, no pain, no love, no forgiveness. He just wanted to move on. Emma realized this with the clarity of someone who can no longer change the outcome. But before leaving, she had one last question. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice breaking. He thought, looked out the window, and replied, for the first time in a long time, "Yes. But not because I'm with someone else. I'm happy to have found myself again. To have discovered that I was worth more than I thought. That the love I offered wasn't small, it was just wasted." She nodded, tears flowing quietly. "Does she love you?" she whispered, and he replied, "She looks at me as if I were enough. And that is everything I've never felt from you." Emma didn't have the strength to fight back. Because he was right. She never knew how to love Liam the way he deserved. Maybe because she was immature, maybe because she didn't understand what real love was until she saw him leave. She stood up, thanked him for the coffee, walked to the door, and before leaving, simply said, "If she ever hurts you, remember I still love you." Liam shook his head with a half-smile, and the answer was simple, "But she wouldn't hurt me. She knows what she has." Emma left without looking back. This time, I knew it was over. That there would be no going back. That even if time healed, that particular love was no longer breathing. And deep down, I knew I deserved this. Not by fate's vengeance, but by life's relentless logic. We reap what we sow, even if we only realize it when the fruit has already fallen from the tree and rotted on the ground. In the following days, Emma tried to regroup. He returned to work, resumed his routine, but there was something broken in his reflection. She looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the woman she used to be. She began therapy, brutally delving into herself. She understood that the betrayal wasn't born from the other person, but from the void she herself couldn't fill. He understood that, before betraying Liam, he had betrayed himself. You spent months trying to reclaim what was left of you after the loss. And in this process, you began to see what you'd never seen clearly, that the biggest mistake wasn't falling in love with someone else, it was underestimating the love you had at home, taking for granted what was rare. Liam, however, was moving forward with his new life with ease. It wasn't a forced happiness, nor an attempt to prove anything. He was simply a rebuilt man, who had learned that love also requires care, but above all, reciprocity. The new woman in his life was simple but genuine. Someone who recognized the value of a small gesture, who didn't expect flowers in return, who was present in the details. And for the first time, Liam wasn't afraid of being abandoned. He felt whole. Months later, Liam and Emma's paths crossed again, not by intention, but by chance. It was at a small cafe downtown. He walked in, ordered his coffee, and turned to see Emma sitting alone, reading a book. Her eyes met his immediately. For a few seconds, time stood still again. But there was no more pain, no more anger. Only a mutual respect for all that had been and all that could no longer be. He nodded, and she smiled sadly. He approached her and asked how she was. She said she was trying. And that she hoped he was okay. He replied that he was. She asked about the woman beside him. He spoke with a gleam in his eyes, not of display, but of quiet pride. He said they were building a good life. Emma smiled sincerely and replied, "You deserve it." Before leaving, she looked into his eyes one last time and said, "Thank you for loving me so much. I'm sorry I wasn't able to love you back the way you deserved." He held her gaze firmly and replied, "You taught me how much I needed to love myself too. And for that, I thank you." Emma lowered her gaze, took a deep breath, and returned to her book. Liam turned and left the cafe, certain that he had closed a cycle without leaving any loose ends. And Emma, in that moment, understood that she had lost something that would never return, the privilege of being loved by someone who knew exactly what love was. And even if she tried to move on, even if she encountered other faces, other names, other stories, there would always be a space inside her where Liam lived. A space no other would occupy, not because he was irreplaceable, but because she knew she was the one to drive him out. And the knowledge of this, that would be her companion for the rest of her life. On that gray afternoon when their eyes met again in the cafe, something invisible closed between them, not violently, not with hurt, but with the exact precision of what had already been lived through. Emma sat for minutes after Liam left, staring into her now cold cup of coffee, feeling the echoes of that brief conversation reverberate like waves within her chest. His words didn't hurt, but they didn't bring relief either. It was as if he'd returned her story with a tight bow around it, as if to say, "Here, it's yours, but I don't carry it with me anymore." And this return of the past, made without bitterness, weighed more heavily than any guilt. Because there was no longer room for hope, for rebuilding, not even for useful regret. Everything was now memory, a memory that would accompany her as an eternal reminder of what had been undone by choices she would never know how to undo. Emma didn't return to her old town often. That afternoon's coffee became a milestone. The memory of that last look remained etched like the unannounced closing of a book she'd reread too many pages of, trying to understand where the story had broken. The answer was clear now, though it took her a while to accept. The story hadn't suddenly broken, it had slowly unraveled, and when it finally did, it was too late to save. She tried to move on with her life, as everyone does after an emotional breakdown. She kept working, meeting new people, filling her schedule with appointments and routines that simulated some semblance of normalcy. But in every new face, there was something missing, something she only recognized after losing it. It was the feeling of being truly seen. Of being cared for without being pressured. Of being loved without the need to be perfect. Meanwhile, Liam continued his steady steps into a new phase. The new woman by his side, Sophie, wasn't a replacement, nor was she a consolation. It was a fresh start built unhurriedly, without ghosts from the past, without comparisons. She arrived slowly, without imposing herself, without trying to fill old spaces, and perhaps that's why she managed to create new spaces within him. Sophie was the opposite of what he knew. She had her own wounds, but unlike Emma, she didn't hide them. She spoke of her pain naturally, faced conflicts with courage, and carried in her gaze a peace that Liam only discovered when he stopped seeking intensity where there was only imbalance. They'd been together for a few months now, and even without promises of eternity, there was a solidity between them that needed no guarantees, just presence. Sophie helped him keep his feet on the ground, but also made him dream again. With her, he could be vulnerable without fear of being abandoned for it. Despite this, there was a hint of caution in Liam. Something deep inside him had been wounded, and even with time and the building of a new life, certain scars didn't disappear, they just healed. There were nights he woke with confused memories, dreaming of scenes from the past that no longer made sense. There were days he still wondered what would have happened if things had been different. But these questions, though present, no longer tortured him. They were just voices that came from time to time, like a passing rain that doesn't wet, only reminds him that the sky was once heavier. Sophie knew. He never asked too many questions, but he also never ignored them. He said everyone has a before. And Liam, little by little, learned to let the past occupy only its rightful place, a memory. Emma, on the other hand, struggled with a deeper dilemma. Even acknowledging her loss, even knowing she couldn't turn back time, there was an urge within her for redemption. But not the kind of redemption that expects reward, but rather the kind that seeks self-understanding. She began a process of internal excavation, visiting emotional places she had buried, facing truths she had always avoided. She discovered, for example, that the reason for her betrayal wasn't a lack of love for Liam, but rather an unresolved need that existed long before she met him. She learned that she was afraid to love deeply because she couldn't handle the risk of being loved back with the same intensity. And that, because of this, she sabotaged everything that was too real. Emma understood that she hadn't betrayed just one man. She had betrayed the woman she could have been. The woman who would have learned to stay, to communicate, to mature alongside someone. She began writing about her experience. Not with the intention of publishing, but as a way to organize her thoughts. Her texts were letters she would never send, confessions Liam would never read. But she wrote anyway, because somehow, it helped her rebuild herself, even if alone. In one of these writings, she wrote a phrase that resonated with her: "I didn't lose a love. I lost the chance to learn what it means to truly love." And this phrase began to guide her days. Not as a lament, but as a constant reminder of the price of her choices. Not to punish herself, but to ensure she would never again ignore the value of someone who loves her completely. At the same time, Liam and Sophie's relationship matured. They moved in together. They took short trips, testing their relationship, and discovered they had more in common than they imagined. Sophie introduced him to her parents, and Liam, over time, shared everything he'd experienced with Emma, without hiding the scars. She didn't react with jealousy or fear, only with understanding. She said what he'd experienced made him more whole, not less worthy. And this acceptance helped Liam free himself from any shame he still carried. By her side, he learned that the past doesn't need to be erased, it just needs to be put into perspective. And this, more than anything, sealed a strong bond between them. It wasn't a love marked by grand gestures, but by constancy, mutual respect, and genuine admiration. A few months later, Liam was invited to participate in a professional seminar in another city. Curiously, the same city where Emma now lived. He hesitated, but eventually decided to go. There was no longer any fear. Only the certainty that he could cross any path without fear of bumping into the past. During the event, one late afternoon, walking alone down a tree-lined street, he saw her. Emma was sitting on a bench, writing in a notebook. Her hair was tied up casually, and she wore reading glasses. She seemed serene. She didn't see him right away. He hesitated for a moment, then approached slowly. When she saw him, she smiled, not the smile that expects reconciliation, but a smile of peace. They talked for a few minutes. Emma told her she was writing a book based on true stories of people who had experienced great loss. Liam smiled empathetically. He said he hoped it would be published. She thanked him. At one point, Emma looked at him deeply and said, "You were the truest character in my life." Liam held her gaze, lightly, and replied, "And you were the greatest lesson in mine." And there, on that park bench, amid leaves falling in the wind, they both understood that their story, though over, had left marks that would never be scars. They would be memories. Vivid, but quiet. Present, but painless. Before they said goodbye, Emma handed him an envelope. "It's a text I wrote for you, but I never had the courage to send it. Now I think I can." Liam took it, thanked her, and promised to read it calmly. They exchanged a final glance and went their separate ways down the street. She returned to the bench and resumed writing. He continued on to his hotel, the envelope in his pocket and his heart at peace. Later, in the silence of the room, he opened the envelope and read. The words were sincere, stark, and unadorned. In the end, one last sentence resonated with him: "If I could go back in time, I wouldn't have done it any differently. It would have been different." He carefully closed the paper, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. And in that moment, he knew he was ready to take the next step. But there was still a choice to make. A choice that would change everything. The morning after that brief and unexpected reunion, Liam woke earlier than usual, with the envelope still on his hotel desk, already read but not fully digested. Emma's words were there, printed with a sincerity he no longer expected from her. Not for lack of ability, but for lack of time. They sounded like a belated confession, but at the same time, like a genuine effort from someone who finally understood the depth of the love she had and the mistake she had made. However, what impacted him most wasn't the regret itself, it was the maturity contained in the final sentence. It wasn't about going back in time to erase it, it was about having been a better person back then. Liam now understood that some pains only make sense much later, when the storm passes and the ruins become visible in the sunlight. And it was this clarity that led him, that morning, to make a decision he had been putting off for months, to make peace with everything unresolved within him, not only with Emma, but with himself. He no longer needed excuses or justifications. He just needed to keep moving forward with a clear heart. After the seminar ended, Liam decided not to return immediately. He called Sophie and told her he would stay for 2 more days. She didn't question him, simply replied with a, "Take care of yourself." This was one of the reasons he loved her. Sophie trusted without needing to control, loved without suffocating. Her presence was like a shelter, firm but light, constant but never imposing. Liam spent the day walking, visiting places he knew only from photos, trying to absorb the silence of a city that once housed his rubble. He felt different there. As if he was no longer the same version of himself who had left months ago with heavy shoulders and a broken chest. Back then, he had left as someone trying to escape pain. Now, he was there as someone deciding to go through it. And there was something beautiful in that. Because, deep down, that was what Emma was doing too. In different ways, but with the same goal, to survive her own choices. That night, while he was dining alone in a low-key restaurant, his phone vibrated. It was a message from her. Short. Just one sentence: "If you can, I'd like to show you a place tomorrow." He read it, took a while to respond, but finally typed, "Send me the address." She replied with a simple thank you and arranged to meet him in the early afternoon. The next day, he went to the recommended place, a small bookstore tucked away among alleys of ancient architecture. Emma was waiting for him at the door, a notebook in her hands and a calm expression on her face. The place smelled of wood and old paper, and inside was a small back room where the owners allowed independent authors to hold private readings. Emma led him there without explaining anything. When they sat down, she opened the notebook, took a deep breath, and said, "I want to read something to you. It's not about me, or about you. It's about what I've come to understand about love after everything." Liam, without saying a word, nodded. And then she read. The text contained no names, no dates, no explicit scenes of what they had experienced. But it contained raw emotions, words that excavated the feeling of loss not as punishment, but as an opportunity for awakening. It was a story about a woman who had loved badly, not for lack of love, but for lack of preparation. Who destroyed the very thing that held her most dear for fear of needing him too much. And about a man who needed to be broken to discover he was worth more than he imagined. The reading took a few minutes, and throughout it, Liam remained silent, eyes fixed on her, as if watching the closing of a cycle without needing to actively participate in it. When she finished, she closed the notebook and said, "This text will be published in my book. But it needed to be read by you first." He took a deep breath and replied, "It was like hearing our story told with dignity." Emma smiled with relief, and in that smile, Liam saw no longer the woman he had loved, but someone who was finally learning to love herself. Leaving the bookstore, they walked for a few blocks. The sun was setting, dyeing the sky golden, as if the universe had decided to frame that moment. Emma talked about future plans, about the publication of her book, about a writing course she was considering abroad. Liam listened with interest, but no longer saw himself as part of those journeys. It was like listening to the plans of an old friend, someone you sincerely root for, but without any emotional connection that would want to relive the past. When they stopped on a corner, ready to say goodbye, Emma looked at him and said, "You are the greatest character in my life. And because of that, you will never be just a memory." Liam smiled and replied, "You helped me become who I am today." It wasn't pretty, but it was true. And with a respectful handshake, they turned in opposite directions, certain that, although they had once been love, they were now just silent witnesses to what they had lived, and survivors of it. That night, back at the hotel, Liam called Sophie. He told her everything. About the meeting, the text, the words he'd read, the true goodbye. She didn't react with insecurity or fear. She simply asked, "And how did you feel hearing all of this?" He calmly replied, "At peace." And Sophie, smiling on the other end, said, "Then this is what you needed." They agreed that he would return the next day and they would spend the weekend together, away from everything, just the two of them. When they hung up, Liam stared at the ceiling for a few minutes. He thought about how life has its discreet ways of putting everything back in its place. And how the truth, even when it arrives late, still has the power to free us. Not because it repairs the damage, but because it allows us to stop carrying what is no longer ours. That same night, Emma wrote the last page of the book. The dedication was simple, "To the one who loved me even when I didn't know how to love back." And as she wrote those words, she cried. But it was a different kind of cry. Not of guilt, not of pain. It was a cry of liberation. Because, for the first time, she wasn't crying for the loss, but for what she learned from it. And this awareness, more than any reconciliation, was what would give meaning to the rest of her life. In the silence of her room, alone with her words, Emma knew she would never have Liam back, and she also knew she would never be the same woman she was before. And that, as hard as it was growth. The next morning, Liam returned home. Sophie was waiting for him on the porch, with a serene smile and a look that said, "You're mine now." And seeing her there, he understood that true love isn't the kind that screams loudly, but the kind that endures even when everything else falls silent. They embraced for a long time, and in that embrace was everything he'd ever wanted: peace, reciprocity, a future. And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty, the story with Emma was over. But his story, after all, was just beginning. Liam and Sophie chose to spend that weekend at a simple inn on the outskirts of a mountainous region, where cell phone reception was weak and time seemed to have a different measure. The winding road there served as a symbolic transition between the past Liam was leaving behind and the present he now desired to live fully. Their conversations, during the drives and walks, ranged from plans for the coming months to reflections on past choices and the scars they left. But there was no room for demands, only mutual listening. Sophie hugged him when he fell silent and didn't demand explanations, simply offering him the space he needed to be whole again. Liam, in that new environment, began to realize something he hadn't yet allowed himself to accept. He had overcome not only Emma, but the old version of himself, the one who believed he was only worthy of love when he sacrificed his own essence to keep someone close. Sophie didn't demand sacrifices, she walked beside him because she wanted to, not because she needed an emotional hero to save her from herself. One night, sitting before the fireplace, she looked at him with the serene eyes of someone who sees beyond words and asked if he saw himself building something lasting with her. The question was unhurried, but it held depth. Liam didn't hesitate. He said yes. Not with the impulsive enthusiasm of someone wanting to prove a point, but with the firmness of someone who understands the value of constancy after having experienced the collapse of instability. There, in that moment, something inside him was anchored once and for all. The past, finally, was just a detail of who he was. And the present was what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Emma was finalizing her book. The publisher had approved its publication, and she would receive invitations for short interviews and literary events. The bitter irony was that, by telling the story of loss, she had found her voice. But there were still holes. There were still nights when the silence of the house seemed to echo louder than any sound. There were still moments when a scent on the street or a snippet of music completely disarmed her. Emma knew these memories wouldn't disappear, and over time, she learned not to try to erase them. She kept everything inside an internal compartment where the truths she learned too late resided. The book's success surprised her. She received messages from readers saying they saw themselves in her words, that they cried, that they reflected. But for her, this wasn't redemption. It was simply a way to warn others not to make the same mistake. In a live interview, a journalist asked if the story was autobiographical. She smiled tightly and said, "It's inspired by a reality that taught me, in the most painful way, that love only survives where there is truth and courage. And I failed at both." Fate would cross their paths one last time, but not through meetings. At a charity event hosted by the publisher, Sophie met Emma by chance. It was a brief encounter in the lobby of a hotel where the event was taking place. Sophie was with one of the organizers, who introduced her as Liam's current partner. Emma extended her hand with a polite smile, and Sophie shook it lightly, looking into her eyes. There was no hostility, no rivalry. Just a silent recognition between two women who, through opposite paths, had found the same man. Emma complimented Sophie's dress and wished her luck with her relationship. Sophie thanked her and said, "He deserves the best. I hope you're doing well." Emma nodded, her eyes filled with emotion, and replied, "Now I'm learning to be." Afterward, they walked in opposite directions, knowing that this was the silent farewell to a story that would never be repeated. The years passed. Liam and Sophie were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by a few, but all essential, people. He wore a navy suit and smiled serenely, not with the nervousness of someone fearing the future, but with the tranquility of someone confident in the journey about to begin. During the vows, he didn't mention the past, but each word carried the weight of everything he had overcome. Sophie looked at him tenderly, without needing to know every detail, because it was enough to know that, at that altar, the man before her had chosen to start over. After the wedding, they lived in a small house with a backyard garden. And with each new day, Liam reaffirmed to himself that love isn't about fleeting intensity, but about daily presence. He had found not just a new love, but a new way of loving, lighter, fairer, truer. Emma continued her life between trips and events, but always returned home alone. She never again became seriously involved with anyone. Not because she lacked opportunities, but because something inside her had changed definitively. She had become more selective, more introspective. And, in a way, that solitude was now her way of respecting the history she had lived. She would never try to replace the love she lost with anyone else. She was surrounded by readers, colleagues, and public moments, but her private life was marked by silence and introspection. In a late interview, years later, when she was already an established author, she was asked about regrets. And her answer was clear: "I regret having learned about love when it was too late to truly love." It made headlines. But for her, it was just a confession that no one else needed to hear, except her own conscience. And so, as life continued on two parallel paths that would never meet again, each found their own way to deal with the choices they had made. Liam built a new family based on dialogue and reciprocity. Sophie gave him everything he offered, all of which had previously been wasted. And Emma became a voice that echoed in the ears of thousands, but never again found an echo in a heart that waited for her. She knew, deep down, that her greatest punishment was being left by a man who still loved her, and who chose to leave, not because he stopped loving, but because he finally learned to love himself more than he loved someone who didn't know how to value him. If you've made it this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. We want to hear your opinion, your experience, and your perspective. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this. Here, with each new video, you'll find profound reflections on the paths of love, loss, and choices. This story clearly shows us that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys what's most precious between two people: trust, respect, and the very essence of each other. When someone decides to cheat, they're not just seeking momentary pleasure, they're choosing to abandon a relationship, renege on a commitment, and ignore the value of the other. And often, they only realize the weight of this decision when it's too late to repair it. Always remember, true love is built on loyalty, presence, and daily care. Cheating is giving up all of this, and the consequence is almost always losing something that will never be found again. This channel does not, under any circumstances, support any kind of betrayal. What you hear here are fictional stories, but with real messages. May this story serve as a mirror for our attitudes, and as a warning about what we are willing to sacrifice for fleeting impulses. Because some losses are forever.